All right, we will go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We are coming to you from the state of Colorado, the Department of Education. My name is Renee Martinez, and I'm with the Online and Blended Learning Office. And with me today is Mallorie Klemm, a senior consultant within our office as well. And our office supports various stakeholders statewide with all facets of online and blended learning, from the application process of a new school to fielding questions from families seeking an online and blended option for students. And let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. All right.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. As Renee mentioned, I'm Mallorie, and we work in Colorado Department of Education's Office for Online and Blended Learning. We see that some people are joining us, so thank you for taking the time to come to our session today. We're excited to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in Colorado specifically, and just want to be transparent in that we're really focusing on our session with our state. So depending on where you're at in your role in education, if you're an educator, maybe you work at your state level or in the agency, organization, ally realm, just want to encourage you to think about how our information might apply to your state. And a teaser at the end, we have a reflection question just about an action item that you can take away for what you in your role in education can do with how our approach might apply to you, if that's learn about your state's laws, statute, regulations, guidance, or potentially becoming an ally or advocate, finding out what your Department of Ed is doing in your state. So just something to think about as we go through our content today. Some specific goals about what we're going to be discussing. First, we're going to talk about our rules and regulations in Colorado. So kind of setting the stage for what parameters are we at the state level with our Department of Ed working within that our districts and schools are also abiding by. What is our state's blended learning initiative? And how is the BLI, an acronym we'll use for the Blended Learning Initiative, engaging stakeholders in education throughout Colorado? And then what are our recommendations and next steps for ourselves and then for you all as attendees? So thanks again for joining us. What we're going to do next is we're going to go into a Padlet, and we would love to just have everyone share a little bit about you. And if you wouldn't mind checking out the chat for our Padlet link, you'll want to use this throughout the session today. So feel free to keep it up in your browser because we will come back to it for our breakout groups and then some other questions. But to show you our Padlet, the link, of course, in the chat. If you haven't used this tool before, there are some screenshots essentially about how to participate in this during our session. So essentially we have different columns that we're going to use throughout today, and you can utilize the plus sign under each to add any information or feedback as we go. So right now, wanting to know from you about you. So you've seen that I've added myself, what state I'm in, what organization I'm in. So if you want to take a moment and add that information for you as well. And then our next question is our star rating for your state's current policies. So essentially what you'll do is you see the rate option under 3 different questions that we have. So if you want to take a moment, add about you, feel free to scroll on your end to see who all might be in the room, and then do a quick star rating for your state's current policies. Of course, we're focusing on options for learning in online and blended spaces. So take a moment and navigate that. If you've got any questions about how to utilize this tool for the next few minutes, as you add your about you and your star ratings, please feel free to put that in the chat or feel free to come off of mute. So we'll take a few moments and answer those 2 questions there. And great to see people all throughout the country: Utah, Virginia, Iowa, Washington, South Dakota, other Department of Ed. So thanks for joining us for our session. Some nationwide representation. So if you're joining us late, we are in the Padlet. We'll post that link again in the chat. Feel free to keep that up on your end because we will be using it throughout our session today. And then feel free to do a star rating for how aligned is your state policy with K-12 online learning options and practices. The next question is, how aligned is your state policy with K-12 blended learning options and practices? And then how inclusive is your state with K-12 education stakeholders on policy conversations? So using this star rating system, we will see an average, and we'll come back to that here shortly. So thanks again for joining us in North Carolina as well. Thanks, Jane, for that. So we're going to continue in our presentation for the sake of time. And so we're going to come back, and I'm going to pass it back to Renee to really talk about, in Colorado specifically, what rules and regulations, what are we at the state level, Department of Ed, working within that our schools and districts are also having to abide by.
Great. Thank you, Mallorie. So to better understand where we're headed as a state, it's very helpful to share some context about where we currently are. So the next few slides will share some context about our state. So currently in Colorado, there are 2 ways in which a student can be considered for funding. They're either considered a brick and mortar student or an online student. There's no in between. And we have many students that are accessing online opportunities for a variety of reasons. However, we remain in a space where the funding model is based on seat time. And even though there are provisions for funding of students in online schools and programs in our state, there's currently no funding parameters for a student who's both brick and mortar and wanting to take online courses. Okay, and this slide shares some policy that we have within our state. First, we see the Online Schools Act, which was enacted in 2008. And what this includes is provisions for online schools and programs to exist in our state, and outlines the requirements that need to be met in order to operate one, including the application process for certification to run an online school with statewide enrollment, or what we refer to as a multi-district online school, or an MDOL. Or a single district online school or program, or SDOL is what we refer to it as. And single district online programs and schools only enroll students within their district and come with some limitations in terms of out of district students, as well as the number of students served in an online program. And when legislation is passed in our state, such as the Online Act, the State Board of Education promulgates rules for the legislation to guide the Department of Education to implement those laws. And so we do have board rule around the administration, certification, oversight of online programs and schools in our state. And then we also have policy which allows for supplemental online courses and blended learning courses. This is a state-funded program that students who are not enrolled in an online school or program can access and take online courses or blended learning courses to supplement their brick and mortar schedule. And let's see, go to the next slide, thank you. And then last but not least, and perhaps the most important one, is what we refer to as the Public School Finance Act. The most current version of the School Finance Act was enacted in 1994 and outlines requirements for the distribution of funding for students in the state. And because this law was enacted so many years before the onset of online learning in our state, it's based on a seat time model for calculating funding. And there's a disconnect in the way that students in models that are outside of seat time are considered for funding. And because of the Online Act, which codified online learning in settings other than a classroom or physical classroom, there have been some adjustments in the interpretation of the Public School Finance Act to determine funding for students enrolled in online schools and programs. Okay, then we come to the onset of the pandemic, which shut down in-person learning and shifted all students in our state to a remote learning environment. In order to accommodate this, there had to be a blanket waiver that was provided to all districts in the state. And it was possible through an adjustment of language related to independent study within the school finance rule, and was applied to pandemic learning. And as we move beyond the pandemic, as a state, we grapple with the continuance of flexible learning models and the lack of needed policies that allow for students that are learning in those type of settings to be funded. And then the other conundrum is related to ensuring quality and equity and flexible learning opportunities for our students. Okay, and this slide is a quick visual of where we were pre-pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic, and then where we are working to be post-pandemic. And with that, we're going to go ahead and do a breakout activity. We'll put you in breakout rooms, and we have a couple questions we'd like to hear from you about. How has the pandemic impacted K-12 education policy in your state? And what is one positive impact and one negative impact of the pandemic in your specific role in education? And if you could please have one person from your breakout room add a comment. All right, great. Well, thank you for indulging us in that conversation. Let's see. Our group shared some really interesting conversation about where they were before the pandemic, of course, and with the onset of online learning becoming more prevalent, how those policies may not have shifted as quickly. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. If you would like to refer to the Padlet to see what others have shared and what others discussed, you can do that. And let's see. So I share the visual of the past, present, and future in terms of the flexible learning models. We had, as a state, we had to determine how to continue to allow for flexible learning models until we get to that space of where the policies catch up with the practices. So of course, as I shared on the previous slides, the policies around multi-district and single district online schools, as well as the supplemental online courses and blended learning courses. There are some other pathways that are available through various statutes, not necessarily through our office, but allow for students to learn in flexible ways. Most of these are with the post-secondary and workforce readiness unit. So if you're interested in those, we can definitely share that link and you can learn more about those different initiatives. One thing I wanted to point out on this slide is the variance waiver process. And as I mentioned before we broke out into groups, there was also the need to ensure quality and equity for students who chose to continue learning in a flexible learning model after the pandemic. And to accommodate that quality and equity, guidance was developed at the department that included some guardrails for those that continue to offer those opportunities. And this was specific to students in brick and mortar schools that were not enrolled in an online school. And if the district or school wasn't able to meet the requirements of the guidance, they were able to apply for a 2-year waiver, or which we call the variance waiver. And as part of that waiver, we requested data on various aspects of the needs in hopes of utilizing that data to inform the policy discussions. Okay, and as mentioned, we have a problem that we need to solve. And some of the key points that we're hoping to address with this work, which Mallorie will go into a little bit more into detail in the next few slides, are here on this slide. All right, and to begin to address the problem and segue into Mallorie's portion, we set out on what we call the Blended Learning Initiative, or the BLI. As we transition into 2023 and the conclusion of this 2-year initiative, our goal is to recommend appropriate data-driven Colorado policy recommendations for consideration. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mallorie.
Thanks, Renee. So Renee really set the stage for where is Colorado at right now in terms of our laws and guidance that we at the department are working within. And so the Blended Learning Initiative is an initiative developed by the Colorado Department of Education. And it's a 2-year initiative. So from the 2021, 2022, so last school year, and then this school year, the 2022, 2023, it's hard to believe that we're even talking about 2023 right now, are the 2 years that essentially the BLI is within. And so what I'm going to cover are how CDE, the Colorado Department of Education, how we all in our office have approached engaging statewide stakeholders to really take a look at our current policy So Renee went through our Online Schools Act, our Public School Finance Act, our State Board Rule, a lot of different areas in Colorado that we're working within, some dated law and guidance. And so how can we go about potentially providing policy reform in our state to our education laws, statute, guidance, and so on? So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through a very quick timeline. Renee very much went through, of course, how the pandemic impacted all of us in education nationwide throughout the world. And so really what sparked the BLI was in January of 2021, we were getting questions from the districts and schools throughout Colorado, as we call the field, about what flexible opportunities would K through 12 students and educators have access to for that first year of the BLI, the 21-22 school year. And so we, of course, had the 100% remote emergency flexibilities that were provided in 2020 as a result of the pandemic, when everyone shifted to emergency remote learning online. So in those parameters of our School Finance Act, of our Online School Act, we developed in collaboration with our School Finance Unit and our School Auditing Office a waiver, as Renee had mentioned, to our blended learning and supplemental online courses. So that was our first approach was, all right, we have this subset of students who really benefited from an online model because of the pandemic, because of 100% remote learning. How can we still allow districts and schools to provide those unique instructional models on either 100% online, 100% remote from home, or in a blended capacity? So some online, some remote at home, but then the additive piece in a blended model of maybe coming to school or on-site in person for some of that. And so we developed these flexibilities with guardrails, as we call it, because still, again, working within our existing state law, how can we allow districts and schools to continue implementing instructional models to students who benefited from that setting, so in their public school districts and schools. And so that's where we developed with our School Auditing Office the variance waiver, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about. Something that was crucial in our blended learning initiative, our 2-year initiative, was absolutely keeping our State Board of Education informed about what we were doing with the BLI, the waiver that we were providing to districts and schools on the amount of online and blended learning courses that they could provide for full-time or part-time funding, as well as the location or the percentage of synchronous instruction. So keeping our State Board of Education informed is crucial for us when we're thinking about policy reform and presenting policy considerations to them this upcoming spring once we conclude this 2-year initiative. And so what then came in June and July in preparation of the 2021-22 school year, our School Auditing Office took a look at our current auditing guide and what that indicated in terms of blended learning and supplemental online learning that districts and schools could implement for students. And so guidance was developed on how to work outside of those parameters using the variance waiver and waiving some of those requirements to still receive funding for these students and still provide instructional models for students that benefited from that through the pandemic or perhaps before, but expanding those flexibilities for our districts and schools. And so therefore, that was kind of the kickoff to this 2-year BLI, taking a look at the current funding model, what was allowed for full-time and part-time students with our School Auditing Office at the state level, and then developing a 2-year waiver. And the 2 years was the emphasis on allowing us at the Colorado Department of Education to gather data, to facilitate research and stakeholder engagement activities, to give ourselves 2 years to allow districts and schools to still function in those instructional models, but then also have hopefully enough information prepared to present to the state board this upcoming spring. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself as I describe this timeline, but essentially what I will focus on is talking about what were some of those stakeholder engagement activities that we developed through the BLI. So if our plan is to go to the State Board of Education, have 2 years worth of research and data from our school districts, as well as from research that we contracted out to have done on blended and online learning to hopefully reform our state's policies. How do we engage those stakeholders to give districts, schools, families a voice in sharing their perspectives, their experiences with online and blended learning, to then take that to our State Board of Education. So essentially what we did was we developed our 2021-2022 Blended Learning Initiative activities. And you can see that here in November of last year, we facilitated at the district level. So we gathered and offered the opportunity and invited district level administrators and leaders to join us in convening meetings to discuss online and blended learning in Colorado, as well as throughout the country. We took a look at research that was conducted by REL that we had contracted out for, and just had really a lot of robust conversations from November through May. Again, keeping our state board updated on those convening meetings. So providing our State Board of Education presentations about how the Blended Learning Initiative has been going, the conversations that we had with district leaders through those convening meetings, and then what was to come in the future with the BLI. And so getting into 2022, we had then shifted from engaging our district leaders and administrators to contracting with Keystone Policy Center. So our strategy at the Department of Ed was to utilize an external party to facilitate stakeholder engagement for this current year. So we're 3/4 of the way through our blended learning initiative. So it is still in progress, but for this 22-23 school year, how can we then go beyond just district level leaders and administrators to our educators, our teachers, our parents, guardians, and students? So that was the next layer in the BLI of engaging statewide stakeholders in education, starting with our districts and schools, going down to our learners, our students, and then their families as well. And so at the beginning of this school year, we then started facilitating our 22-23 stakeholder engagement activities for our BLI. So that was in the form of focus groups that are happening right now with our educators and our families, and then providing a public-wide survey to educators and families to share their perspectives. So coming up with a couple different spaces, either attending and participating in focus groups that were available throughout the month of October, or utilizing a public survey that we had promoted and advertised out to our educators and families to complete. So a couple different spaces was our strategy for trying to engage families and educators in this initiative. And so where are we at in terms of, well, we're at the end of October right now, nearing November. So we are wrapping up those fall activities with Keystone in the focus groups and surveys available to educators and students. We'll reconvene our district and school leaders that we first met with in our BLI convenings in November of last year through May of this year. And then, of course, the 2-year variance waiver will provide us data as well. So I'm going to break down some of those different engagement activities. And really what our anticipated goal is then, as mentioned, to take the research that we facilitated, the data that we've gathered, the feedback from our statewide stakeholders, and then present policy reform drafts and recommendations to our State Board of Education. So I just said a lot in terms of our timeline. Were there any questions in the chat, or Anyone have any immediate questions before I kind of break down some of those BLI activities a little bit more specifically? It's a lot to take in. Policy reform is a big feat for sure. Well, please feel free to use the chat. We do have another breakout session happening at the end of our presentation, so more discussion and collaboration among you all coming up here soon. So really, what were our goals of this 2-year blended learning initiative? We really wanted to look for an opportunity to develop research and facilitate that, find out what other states are doing. Although Colorado, and if you've ever worked in multiple states in the education level, it can be so different. So really exploring research. One thing that we did at the beginning of the BLI was we contracted out with Rel Central to conduct literature research findings on blended learning and online learning. And so we utilized the research that they found to facilitate our conversations and our convening meetings with district and school administrators and leaders. And so we wanted to see what the research was, which can be a little bit vague and limited, but find out what other states were doing to have conversations if what states did in terms of policy reform, how they approach online and blended learning, fit within Colorado and our state's needs. Certainly taking a look, just like we did at the beginning with Renee, of what existing policies and practices are in place in Colorado. So what are our districts and schools doing in terms of blended and online learning? How can we collect data on how they've structured that? And then really identifying any barriers that are in place to use that to guide our policy recommendations to our State Board of Education. And then in addition to conducting research, seeing what other states are doing, taking a look at our existing law to really guide what is prohibiting students from accessing flexible learning, from schools and educators from facilitating that to meet student needs. What can we do in terms of facilitating conversations with our educators and our families, which then turned into kind of our stakeholder engagement activities. So really talking with districts and schools, talking with educators and talking with families about where are we at in Colorado, what's happening currently, what are the benefits or the guardrails or barriers, and then how can we use that data and research and information to present that to the state board in the spring of 2023 to really represent flexible learning in Colorado and how that can impact online and blended learning laws, as well as our school finance laws. And so how exactly are we engaging stakeholders? So of course you develop these slides and we've kind of covered some of this information already, but how we approached it at the state level. And so if you work with your state Department of Education, or maybe if you're an educator, if you work in a district or school and you're not familiar with maybe how they approach funding, online and blended learning, or you're at the state level and wondering, of course, how to partner with the offices or the staff that facilitate that. A good way to, and I'll go into our recommendations later, but how can you really research or become involved in this at your state level based on what your state's doing? In terms of Colorado and our blended learning initiative, there are 3 specific activities that we wanted to highlight. So Renee had mentioned the formal variance waiver process, and I touched up on that as well, but essentially that is a waiver for the 21-22, 22-23 school years that districts and schools can utilize to still receive full-time or part-time funding for students, but that are accessing blended learning or supplemental online courses more than what's allowed from our auditing office for funding. And so giving districts and schools the opportunity to still provide more than what's currently allowed in our law and guidance for how many online and blended learning courses that a brick and mortar student who's enrolled in a public school can access. The next part of that waiver is also the opportunity to waive the amount of synchronous instruction allowed. So if we're thinking about students who are working in a unique instructional model that are brick and mortar students in their public schools, how many courses are they completing, but also from where? So the synchronous and asynchronous instruction conversation is key for us because that's really what's outlined in our School Finance Act, in our audit guide for funding purposes of how much instruction a school has to provide a brick and mortar student per course. So allowing schools to waive the course requirement. So how many can they offer? They can offer as many as they'd like for the 21, 22, 22, 23 school year and still receive funding for those students. And then how much instruction has to be provided for per course for students to be funded as well. So that's our formal variance waiver process. Our BLI convening meetings are essentially those opportunities that we did in November of 2021 through May of this year to gather Colorado district leaders, advocates, and other organizations in the education entity joined us as well to look over the research findings that we received from REL Central on online and blended learning. How does that apply in Colorado? And then, of course, our stakeholder engagement for this school year involving students, parents, guardians, families, educators as well, and discussions through focus groups and surveys on online and blended learning in Colorado. That is such a key in our hope to present policy recommendations and considerations, are gaining the perspective and voice from our actual learners and our educators in that. And then, of course, then our goal at the end of our 2-year long blended learning initiative is to present then to our State Board of Education, who would then determine what goes to our state legislators. They're kind of the key in this to determine with policymakers what could be revised in terms of our current law and policy in Colorado. So this is just a little bit more of information on these next few slides, but for the sake of time, I kind of summarized our formal variance waiver process, our 2-year waiver for schools and districts, our approach to facilitating monthly convening meetings with district leaders and statewide education advocates, agencies, and organizations, and then what we're doing in terms of engaging our educators and our families in this process. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually take you back into breakout rooms, and I will put in the chat again a link to our Padlet. So give me just a moment. So we're going to go there and in your groups answer questions about what you foresee the lasting implications of the pandemic. So how has the pandemic influenced education? And then as a stakeholder in education, how do you influence the evolution of education through your current role? So what can you do in your role in education? And absolutely, Debbie, what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight our BLI webpage when we come back, just so you can see where you can get more information about our 2-year initiative online, which links out to the audit resource guide as well. So we are going to conduct 5 more minutes in a breakout session. Thanks for meeting with each other to talk about those two. If you want to, again, identify somebody to just add some notes in our Padlet, in the chat is a link to that. We are going to, let's see, create those, and we'll have 5 minutes to talk through those questions together. All right, welcome back, everyone. So thanks for taking a few minutes to maybe chat with new people since we randomized our breakout rooms and talk through those questions. What I want to do real quick is just highlight our BLI webpage, and I put the link in our chat as well. Every link that's in our presentation that you have access to is hyperlinked. So you should be able to go through our presentation and go to anything that we linked out if it was different guidance for our state, our statute, and our blended learning page is linked as well. So if you are curious about us in Colorado and want to learn a little bit more about our BLI and our activities that we've been facilitating that we touched up on, our Blended Learning Initiative page is a public page that anyone can access, and it just gives an overview of our 2-year initiative. It talks about our current 2022-2023 stakeholder engagement. So as mentioned, that's the next layer of engaging our educators and our families in the discussion. You can also take a look at the content and presentation materials for our 21-22 activities, which is when we first initiated conversation with our district leaders, statewide education advocates, and organizations. So all of that is there as well. I want to highlight our REL PowerPoint. Is the research that was facilitated that we began discussing in November in our BLI convenings. And then as well as some other PowerPoints, like the Education Commission for the states came and gave us perspective on what other states are doing. So we did try to include different presenters from research organizations on nationwide blended and online learning. And then, of course, here's our waiver process, that 2-year process that is currently available to districts and schools to waive courses and instruction. That's currently in our audit resource guide that our schools and districts abide by in terms of funding. So that information is there. So just want to take a moment and share that with you all. So to conclude our last section, looks like we've got a good 10 more minutes, so won't keep you over, but want to just share what we are going to be doing next in our BLI. So as our timeline showed, that should be concluding this upcoming spring at the end of the school year. So what are we doing at the state level to conclude the Blended Learning Initiative? Well, the first thing is, of course, to summarize and synthesize the findings that we get data-wise from our waiver process. So within our formal variance waiver process, to the amount of courses and the percentage of instruction, we do require that districts and schools submit us data and narrative forms in terms of what they're doing in those unique instructional learning models for students throughout Colorado. So taking that information, using that as data, and then of course our findings that will come from our focus groups and our surveys that Keystone is supporting. So gathering that information from districts to schools to educators to families and students included. And then we are going to reconvene our BLI stakeholders. So the individuals that joined us for convenings last year, we're going to gather them back, share what we found from that next layer of engagement activities this year that are currently happening with our educators and our families, talk about what we found, share that with district leaders, share that with those statewide advocates, agency groups, and organizations. And then we will reconvene internally at the Department of Ed to utilize that data, our research findings, and begin drafting policy recommendations and considerations to present to our State Board of Education this upcoming spring. And really that is going to be reflective of our field. So what our districts and schools and our different entities in terms of our stakeholders shared to really give a holistic approach to why are we recommending policy reform? Why are our recommendations and considerations to potential funding, potential brick and mortar access to online and blended learning, to what our current laws are. So really utilizing that to give our state board a holistic body of evidence of where are we coming from, what did we gather, how do we engage the public in the field to lead us to the recommendations and considerations that we come up with. What do we recommend for you all as attendees? Again, you shared in the Padlet who you are, your respective states that you're coming from, and like us, your roles in education in your states is so different than ours. But a few things that we thought of that could be helpful is finding out at your state level, either connecting with your state board of education, for us, our Department of Education, and finding out what initiatives are in place or what work is in place in terms of online and blended learning, your different laws, where your funding and school finance are at, to really understand and learn more if you don't already know where your state's at and where it's going, and see if there are opportunities to participate in those conversations and any stakeholder engagement maybe that your state is doing. So if you are posing to maybe facilitate some of this at your state level, thinking about what different modes would work with engaging stakeholders throughout your state. And then, of course, using any feedback or data or research that is gathered to really facilitate with statewide leaders and drive next steps if that applies to your state as well. And then we linked here, and again, Renee had put this in the chat, but you all have linked access to our PowerPoint, is monitoring what's happening at your state, but also nationwide. So we included professional organizations that we subscribe to, that we keep a lookout for in terms of their research or articles that they send out, maybe conferences or symposiums that they host, that we have found some great information about nationwide approaches to blended and online learning. And then even taking a look at your higher education institutions. We have some people in our unit. Renee and I are from our Schools of Choice unit at CDE that are involved at the public affairs or policy conversations, even at the higher education level. So finding some partnership if you were in the K through 12 space, maybe in your higher education institutions. And so we have one final reflection. We know that Aurora Institute has a survey that they will post in the chat as well. So Jessica just did that, but want to bring you back to our Padlet really quick. And just wanted to highlight, we do have an email address for our Blended Learning Initiative. I'm happy to answer any questions that we can elaborate on in terms of our presentation, or maybe you found content in our PowerPoint that we are happy to discuss with you all. Our BLI webpage is linked there again, but wanted to encourage you to go back to our Padlet and find the action items and just give us a reflection in your respective roles in education in your respective states. What's something that you can take away from our approach at Colorado with the Blended Learning Initiative that you can maybe learn more about, do at your level, research more. So if you want to add a reflection there, that is great. And if you had any lingering thoughts from our breakout group discussions and those 4 questions that came up in our breakout sessions, and you wanted to add those in there, you are more than welcome to. And then wanted to take a quick look when we did the star rating system at the very beginning of our presentation. Of course, there's just a small subset of you all that are with us today, but asking how aligned your state policy is with online learning. It looks like we got a 3.5 out of 5. How aligned is your state policy with blended learning? 3.5 out of 5 again. And then how inclusive is your state? Looks kind of the same. So looks like the majority of you feel like your state might be inclusive or aligning policies and practices when it comes to the online and blended learning world of education. So feel free to engage in this Padlet in the next few minutes, or come back to it as we conclude the symposium today and tomorrow. And thank you for attending and participating and learning more about what we at the Colorado Department of Education are doing in terms of policy reform when it comes to flexible learning for our students in our schools. And if there are any lingering questions, I know we have 5 more minutes left. We are happy to stay and chat with you all verbally if there's anything else, or feel free to use the chat as well.